In this video, we're going to do a quick recap by rebuilding our counter example, but this time obviously we'll have much more understanding about what's going on, so we'll be able to race through that bit. I'm then going to cover some quick best practices for Redux before we move on to some of the more advanced topics in the next few videos. So let's have a look at the code. I've got my index.html again. It's exactly the same as last time. I've got the same CSS and I've got a counter.js file, which is just empty. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start by creating our store. So let's just create our store. So as you remember, we are going to create a variable called store, and we're going to use Redux, and we are going to create our store. The create store method takes two arguments that we care about. It takes our reducer and our state. So we're going to call our reducer counter, and we're going to call our state state. That's all we need for our store. We're then going to go ahead and create our reducer. Again, you remember this is just a pure function. So it's a counter. It takes our current state. I'm just going to go ahead and call it state. And it takes our action. It is, of course, just a simple switch statement, and we switch on our action.type. In this case, we're going to obviously have three cases. We're going to have our add case. We're going to have our minus case. And we're going to have our reset case. Let's just tidy this up a little bit. And we also have our default case, and within our default case we are simply going to return our state. So that's our current state if nothing changes. We then of course need to have our actions. Of course we're going to use our event handlers, so we're going to get our elements within our HTML. Again, this should be very familiar, and you should know exactly what's going on now. So we have our click handler, and now we have our function. Don't worry if you want to try and write this yourself when you have to sort of look back at the video. That's perfectly okay. Once you've done it a couple of times, it will just be totally clear and you know exactly what's going on and exactly what you need to do. So of course, within our click handler, we are going to dispatch our actions onto our store. And of course we know our actions are just a simple JavaScript object with a type. They can have a payload, but we'll explore that later on. So that's our simple action. And we'll just copy that twice because it's exactly the same for the other two. Of course, we need to change the element that the action happens on, and we need to change the action type. So in this case, it's going to be minus and now reset. So that's our three actions. This is our counter, this is our reducer, and we have our store. We then, of course, need to have a callback function for our store to call each time an action is dispatched. And we'll call this render because that's what it's going to do for us. It's going to render our state to our UI. So we'll go ahead and get our state from the store using the getState method. And we're going to use our counter EL, which I'll select in a minute. And we're going to change the inner HTML of that to equal state.count, and we'll do that to a string. So that's the method we're going to pass to our subscribe, which is on our store. This is the method that gets called anytime an action is dispatched. So let's just go ahead and get our counter EL element. So document.get element by ID of counter. Excellent. So we're almost there now. We just need to create our new state object in our reducer. So our next state object, which is just going to have a count, and it's going to be our state.count. We then of course need to create our default state, so our count of 0, which we've already passed into our store. And the final thing we need to do is just to change our state and return our new state in our reducer. So we're going to have our next state dot count to equal our current state dot count plus 1 for the add. And don't forget to return our next state, of course, because we have to return something. Let's go ahead and copy that for our minus, which is just going to be -1. Indent that a little bit. And for our reset, we simply set our state back to 0. So that is pretty much everything we need to do to get our simple Redux application working. So if we go ahead and save this, provided I've not made any typos or anything, when we click add, we get a new counter, add 1. When we click minus, we get it taken away. Let's add a few more. And when we reset, it gets set back to 0. So really simple. We have our reducer, we have our store, and we have our actions. And we also have our render function, which gets called every time an action happens. So let's move on to some of the best practices around Redux. So you'll notice that my actions always have capital letters. It's always in uppercase. This is just one of the best practices for Redux, so you can know exactly what an action is. When you see a capitalized word, you can instantly know it is a Redux action, which is great. It makes your life much easier. So that's one best practice. The next best practice is to not pass our state, our initial state, to our create store function. What we actually want to do, and the reason this is the best practice, is we want to be able to handle the case where we don't initialize our state from outside of our reducer. We always want to have a way to handle not having a initial state in our reducer. So as you saw in the last video, when I didn't return any initial state, it's because I wasn't returning the state itself. But you can imagine if I didn't pass in that state to our reducer, so like I've done, I've removed it here, we're not going to have an initial state and it's going to break again. So in fact, if I save this, and notice we're not passing in any state to our create store, refresh, open up our developer tools, and you'll see we can't get count of undefined. And obviously none of these are going to work. And this is because we're not initializing our state. And the way we do this, and the best practice for this, is within our reducer, is to just check whether our state exists. So we check the type of our state object, and if that is undefined, we simply initialize our state. So we simply return our count of 0. So what this is going to do is obviously check if we don't have a state object. So if our state object is undefined, it's going to create our default state for us, and then everything will work as we expect. So if you go ahead and save that, head on back over to your browser, refresh, notice we get no errors and our application works exactly as we would expect. So that's another best practice. So we have capitalized action names, and we then have a way to initialize our default state from within our reducer, so we don't need to pass it into our create store function. And this just makes your life much easier. Now there's another thing that I've done in this small application which isn't really a best practice either. So in our index.html, I'm actually initializing the 0 in the HTML. I'm hard coding that in. And obviously, if that's a dynamic value, we don't want to hard code stuff into our HTML like that. So for this simple application, the best thing to do would be to delete that 0, save your HTML. Let's just check out what that does in our browser. Obviously, our initial count has gone now because we're not having that 0 there. And of course, if we go ahead and click one of the buttons, it will work because we now have that initial state. When we don't have that value hard-coded into our HTML, Redux doesn't actually know how to render that yet because it's not calling the render method because we haven't dispatched an action. Because as you remember, our render function is subscribed to our store. So anytime an action gets called, our render function gets called. And obviously, because we are not calling an action when we initialize, when we first go to the page, we don't have that initial value. So if you were going to build a simple JavaScript application like we have, the best practice is to simply call render in your code to start off with, and that will initialize our state. So that will run through our reducer, and of course our reducer doesn't have an action on it, so it won't find any of these. It will just simply return our state, which is going to be a count of 0. So save that and refresh your browser, and we get our 0 back, and our app works exactly how we would expect it to. So that's just some simple best practice for a plain JavaScript Redux application. And as you can see, we've built this application really quickly, and we know exactly what the methods do now. So we obviously have to create our reducer, and that's just plain JavaScript with a switch statement. We have the best practice of checking that our state is defined. So if it's not defined, we don't have any state, we initialize our state with our default state object. We then create our new state object and we update it in our switch statement. We use the create store method to create our store, and we pass in our reducer. We don't need to pass in our default state because we're handling that in our reducer. We then of course subscribe our store to any actions that get dispatched, and we pass in a function callback that will get called anytime an action gets dispatched. We then of course need to dispatch our actions, and we do that by having handlers on our HTML. So we're listening out for a click. Every time we have a click on that element, we dispatch the corresponding action, and then we simply update our HTML elements with the new state that we can get using the getState method. So that's just a simple recap. So the three sort of main methods that you need to look out for are create store, get state, dispatch, and subscribe. So they are the 4 Redux methods that you're going to use most often. In the next video, we're going to look at the more advanced topic of having multiple reducers. So if you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment, and I'll catch you in the next video.